So we're very appreciative that you were able to reschedule. I met Ben circuitously, through a real estate situation where I had met his wife before, and we were looking at a house, and Ben and Joyce were next door, and I recognized Joyce, and we ended up talking and had a good conversation that afternoon. And he and my husband both work for Armstrong World Industries, so we're very appreciative of that. So tonight he is going to talk about his book called Hero of the Republic. He came to Lake Monticello from Cincinnati by way of, I think, several other states, correct? Right? In 2012, after years as a business person, he's currently serving on the Lake Monticello Board of Directors. Graduated from Ball State with a degree in philosophy, poli-sci and history. Graduated also from Penn State with a master's in education. Has worked with 2 Fortune 500 companies and spent 4 years as an adjunct professor at DeVry University at the Miller Graduate School. He's traveled across the country as a salesman, trainer, and has attended many Civil War roundtable discussions. He became interested in the Civil War in Mrs. Hickson's 7th grade class in Ramsey, New Jersey. So I think all of us can appreciate part of how we came to our own profession out of some teacher somewhere, somebody put a bug in our ear, and we wanted to go on and do something with that. In '91, he read a segment of Carl Sandburg's Lincoln, the Prairie Years and the War Years, and from that he started a 10-year adventure culminating in the publication of his book, Hero of the Republic, and he celebrates his 50th wedding anniversary this year with his lovely wife, Joyce. We're so glad to have you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. You can see that my schedule is not full, and it's very flexible, so if it doesn't happen one week, it can happen the next. I'm going to tell you a little story first off. I was told by Rudy that you get about 20 minutes to speak. He didn't realize that this is my child, my flesh and blood that I put about 10 years into. So to condense it down to 20 minutes, I'll do my very best, I promise. The other is that I was, as a salesman, I was looking for a way to become an automatic positive thinker, and trying to figure out how I could put that on automatic so that when the stuff hit the fan, I would always look for the pony and the heat. And I came across a guy by the name of Dennis Waitley. And Waitley was a psychologist for the Olympic teams. And he wrote a book called The Seeds of Greatness. And his book was, he went out and interviewed great people who did great things, athletes particularly, and wanted to know what separated them from the normal. His theory was that on any given day, any world athlete could, in fact, beat another athlete. So what was that little competitive edge right there? And of course, positive thinking was what he concluded. One of the last segments that I read from Dennis Waitley is that, you know, if you want to be great, you want to be positive in your living, you need to read positive things, put positive things into your mind, and let that loop in your mind always tell you that you can accomplish what you want to accomplish. He even went further and said not only should you read things that are positive, he says go write a book about something positive. And I never thought that would ever come into my life, but it was probably 3 or 4 years down the road that I ran across a short half-page segment in Carl Sandburg's Lincoln, his biography of Lincoln, because I was reading about Lincoln. I had a Lincoln complex, and maybe I could be as great as Lincoln someday. Not really, but I read this segment in the book, and I thought, boy, this is really something. I wonder if anybody's ever written anything about it, about this gentleman that I'm going to talk to you about. And my initial investigation said, no, nobody's ever written anything about it. And so I began to research it. And that put me on a 10-year journey. I don't know about positive thinking. I finished it, so that was positive, I guess. But it put me on a 10-year journey of exploring the life of a young man by the name of James Madison Cutts. Now, I was, as I said, Mrs. Hickson, probably not her best student. I don't even know if she remembered me in her class, but her daughters did. And when the book was published, I sent a copy to Mrs. Hickson, and her daughters wrote me back a very nice letter and said they appreciated what I had to say. And I thanked her for a young boy sitting in her class and how she impacted me basically the rest of my life. Well, when I was reading this book on Lincoln, and I came across a segment where Lincoln was always riling up his generals because he was breaking military law and military tradition, that if somebody was convicted of a serious crime that they should be drummed out of the service. And Lincoln was not doing that. He was lenient to soldiers who had done some bad things, and he was lenient. And so this segment that I was reading about was about a young captain who was charged for conduct unbecoming an officer and for dueling. And Lincoln decided the conduct unbecoming an officer, which was looking over the transom in a hotel, it's something that he probably shouldn't have been looking at. That was something that he was sure that the young man would not do again. But the dueling, of which he didn't do, but of which he was court-martialed for, the dueling, Lincoln gave him some pretty fatherly advice in the form of a reprimand. So he didn't cash him out of the service, he gave him a reprimand. I'm going to read this letter. Lincoln writes a lot better than I do. It says to Captain James Madison Cutts, although what I am about to say to you is to be in form a reprimand, it is not intended to add a pang to what you have already suffered upon the subject to which it relates. This is court-martials. You have too much life yet before you, and have shown too much of promise as an officer for your future to be lightly surrendered. You were convicted of 2 offenses, one of them not of great enormity and yet greatly to be avoided. That was the looking over the transom. I feel sure you are in no danger of repeating. The other you are not so well assured against. The advice of a father to his son, beware of entrance to a quarrel, but being in, bear it that the opposed may be aware of thee. It is good, yet not the best advice. Quarrel not at all. No man resolved to make the most of himself can spare time for personal contentions. Still less can he afford to take all the consequences, including the vitiating of his temper and the loss of self-control. Yield larger things to which you can show no more than equal right, and yield lesser ones, though clearly your own. This is Lincoln, better give your path to a dog than be bitten by him in contesting for the right. Even killing the dog would not cure the bite. Isn't that beautiful? In the mood indicated, deal henceforth with your fellow men, and especially with your brother officers, and even the unpleasant events you are now passing from will not have been profitless to you. A. Lincoln. So the young man got himself in trouble, and Lincoln kind of let him off the hook and sent him back to his military unit, his fighting unit. I looked at this, I read the letter, and I said, man, that's neat. I wonder whatever happened to this guy. Well, Carl Sandburg said what happened to him. He went on to fight in the Civil War, and he was awarded, later in his life, he was awarded a Medal of Honor for gallantry in 3 separate actions. Now, as a historian, I look around and say, well, how many guys have won that distinction? To have gone to the abyss 3 times and made it back alive, and then have somebody recognize your gallantry. Well, there's only one other that I've found in all of the 1,360 Medal of Honors. So that started my curiosity. Where was he from? What did he do? What did he do to earn the medals? What battles was he in? Are there any family members left? And where's the medal? And that started me on, as I said, a 10-year journey in putting his biography together. Now, there's women in the audience, and this is not going to be a story all about one man. So I will tell you that as I began to do the research, I actually contacted his grandson in Washington, D.C., and that was my starting point. Because my grandson said, well, you don't want to talk about my grandfather, you really want to talk about Dolly Madison. She's our great aunt. And so, you can hit it now. So what I found is that this young man grew up in Lafayette Square across from the White House in what they call the Dolly Madison house. That was one area that he was located in. She called him her little Madison. His name was James Madison Cutts, Jr. And he played out in Lafayette Square when he was a little bit, Lafayette Park when he was a little boy. Let's go to the next one. That's Dolly, and she was his great aunt. And that occurred because you'd heard that she's been a matchmaker, or that she was a matchmaker, and she actually connected her youngest sister, her favorite sister, whose name was Anna Payne, to James Madison, to Richard Cutts. And Richard Cutts was a congressman and best friend to James Madison. You can go ahead and click on that. Now there is Anna Payne. And when you look around in history, you find very unusual things. You see what's in the background? She had a discussion while she was posing for the picture of Gilbert Stuart. And the question was, which was the most prominent feature of the human face? And so Anna Payne said, well, of course it's the mouth, it's the lips. And you can imagine what Gilbert Stuart's thoughts were. So the next day when she came in from sitting, he had taken curtains which were in the background and extended them out into his profile. So he said, don't worry about it, I'll paint over it and nobody will ever know that it was there. And she says, oh no, don't paint over it. Who else in the world has a picture painted by Gilbert Stuart with his profile in the painting? So it shows you kind of the sense of humor that the Dolly Payne and Dolly Payne Madison and Anna Payne had as a family member. Well, there's some other people that I came across. This right here is James Madison Cutts' sister. Her name is Rose Adele Cutts. And Rose was considered as one of the most beautiful women in Washington, D.C. In the 1850s, so to speak. She became the second wife of Stephen Douglas. Douglas was 42, she was 21. It caused somewhat of a scandal, but she served as his wife for a couple of years until he passed away. Finally, in my research, I came across James Madison Cutts' aunt. This was for the women in the audience. Came across his aunt, and his aunt was a lady by the name of Rose O'Neill Greenhow. Now, Rose O'Neill Greenhow, after the war started, after the Civil War started, became the most famous of the Confederate spies. Rose had a house in Washington, D.C., where a lot of gentlemen attended, and she had a bunch of young ladies that attended to the young men, and she learned information about the transfer of troops and so forth. And she was credited as being the support for the Confederacy in winning the first Battle of Bull Run. So So that was the family of this fella, James Madison Cutts Jr. Well, who was he? Well, he was a pretty smart guy. He, next slide, he went to Brown University and graduated at the top of his class. Then he left there and went to, that's a rough picture, but it is the gates at Harvard University, and he went to Harvard Law School. And he graduated at the top of his class at Harvard Law School. As a matter of fact, when he went to Brown, he was given the honor of giving the graduation speech. He was #1 at Brown. And his graduation speech was on the responsibilities of the American citizen. It's a great speech. It applies today like you wouldn't believe, but it's excellent. He gave that speech. From there, he was recommended, well, not yet. Can you go back? Okay, he was recommended to join a law firm in St. Louis, Missouri. He became secretary to his brother-in-law and served with Stephen Douglas throughout the South as Douglas was rounding up his presidential campaign of 1860. Following the defeat, they were down in New Orleans, so they came back up through St. Louis. Douglas gave him a letter of recommendation. He went, joined a law firm, and was a lawyer for about a year until the start of the war. When the war started, he actually joined the Army as a private, but Lincoln was taking all people with college degrees and making them captains, and so he was made a captain in the Union Army. And he applied for and was allowed to come on the staff of General Burnside. We all know him. He was on the staff of Burnside. He was in a number of different areas, but his first engagement was in Maryland, where he fought in the Battle of Antietam. And let me see if we have that. What's the next? Okay, outside of Antietam, or after the Battle of Antietam, this right here was the staff of Burnside. Let me see if I can get things going here real quick. That's Burnside right here. This is Cutts right here, James Madison Cutts. These two guys right here are the two guys. This guy challenged Cutts to a duel later on, and this guy carried the duel. So all three members get court-martialed in a dueling type situation. Okay, nobody got shot. Cutts refused to duel. He said he proved his gallantry out on the battlefield. These guys ended up staying with Burnside, and he went on to different things. Okay, the next one is the first major battle that Cutts fought in was the Battle of Antietam. It's right up the road here a little ways. You history buffs, this is the Antietam River. Down here is Burnside's, or Antietam Creek here. Burnside's headquarters was here. There's a big mountain right here, as well as a mountain running down along here. And right in here in the middle is Burnside's Bridge. It's a famous bridge. It took Burnside's just about all day to get his men in the right position to be able to cross the bridge. Confederates were all lined up on this side of the hill, firing down on this bridge. Cutts was in on the initial attack going across the bridge, and was looked upon with great gallantry. After the Union Army had crossed the bridge, then they came up here and tried to turn the corner of the Confederacy here. That failed, and after a full day's fighting, the line stayed pretty much the same as it was. However, Cutts was recognized for his gallantry really right there. He never awarded anything for it, but they knew that he was there and that he had served greatly. Let's go to the next slide. Today is Burnside's Bridge. Over here would be the Union side. Up in this hill on this side is Confederacy. That bridge is still there. That tree used to be there, I think. I'm not sure if it's still there right now, but it was a witness. The original tree was a witness to that battle. Next slide. This is looking down on the bridge from the opposite side, from the Confederate side. So Cutts was back here behind the wall. They ordered a charge, and they came across this bridge, and everybody in here was shooting at him. So it's kind of a harrowing type situation. It took a lot of bravery just to go across the bridge. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Later, they find themselves with Burnside being the head of the whole Army of the Potomac. Cutts was a captain at the time, and he was on Burnside's staff. So as a staff, and they're at Fredericksburg, which is right up the road here as well. The interesting thing here is that Cutts rode all the way down to Franklin's unit and rode back up along in here, came back, went across the bridge, and would report to General Burnside as to the condition of the line and what was going on there. And he did it a number of times, and he was recognized there as being gallant and providing a lot of information based on a comment by General Burnside. Now what happens is he gets around one of these buildings. These are buildings right here at Fredericksburg. And he's around one of these buildings where they're firing cannons. And he sees that there's two people from Burnside's staff that are kind of hiding behind the buildings and not standing out in the open as a gallant officer would in directing cannon fire. And so as a result, when he goes back up to his headquarters, up here, I think it was in a house called Chatham House. He gets up there and he tells the chief of staff, he reports to the general, he tells the chief of staff, he says, you know, there's two guys down there hiding behind buildings. They shouldn't be doing that, and I hope you'll reprimand them when this thing's all over with. And the chief of staff says, yeah, we'll do that. Well, what happens is Burnside does reprimand the two people, and then things begin to fall apart. Burnside tries a thing called the mud march. That fails. He eventually leaves Fredericksburg and is relieved to command and sent with a unit to Cincinnati, Ohio. And while in Cincinnati, Ohio, he's in charge of the whole Department of the Ohio. Two things happen there that are significant for Captain Cutts. And that is, the first is he is caught looking over the transom. And the second thing is one of the officers here behind the building that ordered his reprimand challenged him to a duel and claimed that he said he was a coward. And so he challenged Cutts to a duel for making that accusation. The other officer, which was a Major Cutting, he delivered the message for the duel. So all three of them now are involved. So they have this court-martial. Cutts gets court-martialed for conduct unbecoming an officer. He gets court-martialed and sentenced to be dismissed from the service for dueling, of which he did not do. The other two officers got off the hook, so there was obviously some treachery involved here, and that was not a good deal. So he's ordered back to Washington, D.C., and he later, shortly thereafter, is invited to the White House to receive his personal reprimand from Abraham Lincoln. So he goes and does that. Now, how does that happen? Well, I remember I told you that his sister was married to Stephen Douglas. Douglas and Lincoln were kind of opposition of each other, but they were also friends. And so his sister conducted a lot of the social activities for Lincoln after Mary Lincoln decided she didn't attend any social functions in Washington. So Lincoln then writes him this reprimand, this letter of reprimand that I read to you, and told him, now go on back and fight with your soldiers, your fellow soldiers, and so he did. So that was Fredericksburg, Cincinnati. Go ahead. That's the Burnett House in Cincinnati. It's no longer there, but it was a great house. There's Lincoln. Go ahead. got Lincoln taken care of. Lincoln, in the interim, or around this time, or before this time of the reprimand, he ordered General Grant to take over the whole Army of the Potomac. Yes, ma'am.
She's here for the next meeting.
Oh. Does that mean I'm done? Okay. Let's go ahead and keep moving. General Grant takes over the Army of the Potomac. Captain Cutts is sent back to his unit with the Army of the Potomac, and here we go. Grant basically starts his, in 1864, May 5th of 1864, he starts his, what's called the Overland Campaign. And this is where Grant says, we're going to Richmond come hell or high water. And so the first engagement that they run into is a place called the Battle of the Wilderness. It's up on Highway 3 between Orange and Fredericksburg. You've probably driven by it 100 times. You've actually driven by the field that Cutts was in on the first day of the battle. The first day of the battle took place over here. Where's the road? He's over here someplace in what's termed as Saunders Field, or Sanders Field. And he, along with the 11th U.S. Infantry, which he was part of, charged up through this field. You can go to the next slide. Through this field. Now, Cutts would have come from here. This is all open space in here. And up in here is where the Confederates were. So he charged up the field, and they actually pressed the Confederates about a half mile back into the woods, and then the woods caught on fire. So when the woods caught on fire, it was a heck of a show. They had to retreat, get back out of there, but Cutts was acclaimed for standing his ground with his unit right here. Now, he needed to do that because there was another unit that was late coming up on his right flank, and so to keep this whole thing from curling back around on the line, Cutts and his unit stayed up here. He stayed in command until it was time to be relieved, and he was relieved and came back. And he was recognized. His commanding officer sent out an aide to him and said, "You've been duly recognized for excellent behavior in the battle of the Wilderness." So what happens? Well, the next day the lines stay pretty much the same, but they have a fierce battle on the 6th of May. And then on the 7th of May at night, they move down from a place up in here, which is the Wilderness. They come down Brock's Road. It's still there. And you come down Brock's Road down to a place that's listed as Laurel Hill. And that is still there today as well, if you ever want to go and see it. They have a monument there and so forth. Here he is with his unit here, Warren's unit. And on the 8th of May, Warren makes an attack up against the Confederates here in a place called Laurel Hill, or Laurel Hill right here. And they get up on the hill. They get to Sarah Spindle's house, and the house catches on fire. The Confederates are in a bunch of trees. I think on the next slide I'll show you what that looks like. This is the hill going up to Laurel Hill. Next slide. Sarah Spindle's house is right here, and there was a tree line all across here. So after climbing up all of this open field, they go into Sarah Spindle's house, which is open. Then they had to fight the Confederates that were in the trees. They were well dug in, and their attack failed, and they came back down. Still, his commander recognized Captain Cutts for his bravery and gallantry for maintaining the soldiers up on the hill during the attack. He comes back down. They come back down. Next slide. Here he is over here. The next day, or 2 days later, on the 12th of May, is the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. It's a famous battle in the Civil War. Some of you may be aware of it. Warren's guys kind of set out that day in the battle, but they stood up here in reserve. But the battle was They crushed in on the horseshoe right here, or the mule shoe, and the battle was not good for Lee, but Lee's forces still held this space after the day was over with. They fought for 18 hours in this battle, and one of the unique things in this battle is that at the end of the day, it was about 12 o'clock at night, soldiers on both sides recognized that an oak tree 24 inches around, 24 inches in diameter, I guess, an oak tree fell over. And the significance of that is it was cut down by mini bulls. And if you don't believe me, it's in the U.S. History Museum in Washington, D.C. There's a stump in there, and that's where this stump came from. Fascinating stuff in history. So then after this, they begin to do what they call sidling. Next slide. And Grant says, we're going to Richmond one way or the other. So here's the wilderness. A few days later, they stop here at the courthouse and have a major battle. It rains afterwards, so they can't move. But when it stops raining, they move on down, and they stop at a place, or they confront Lee again at the Battle of North Anna. That battlefield is still there, but it's back in the woods. It's tough to get to, but it's still there. And it's unique. Well, let me go to the next one. After that battle, they move on down to Cold Harbor. You probably have heard of the Battle of Cold Harbor in your history books. It was devastating, and the reason for it was that the Confederates in this traveling down realized that they could build embankments, they could build fortifications quickly. Overnight they could build up a fortification, and it could slow the Union Army down. Well, when they get down here on about the 1st and 2nd of June, they construct fortifications. And on the 3rd of June, Grant orders his whole Union Army to attack. And within 30 minutes, he loses 8,000 people. So he kind of pulls himself back a little bit. They wait for several days here for Lee to give him permission to go out onto the battlefield and pick up the wounded. And Lee says, no. He says, none of the wounded are mine. So we'll just leave them out there. And that's why so many of them died. And of course, a lot of them made it back to the line. But that was Cold Harbor, and that's why it's such a devastating battle in the Civil War. Well, what happens then? Well, at nighttime, several days later, Grant goes through what's known as White Oak Swamp down here, crosses the James River, and starts moving on the southern town of Petersburg. We all know where Petersburg is. What's the significance of that? Well, he figures he can't go in here directly to Richmond, and so he's going to go south to Petersburg. This had 5 railroads going into it, and it provided goods and food and so forth into Richmond. So he figures, well, if I go down here and cut this off, and I have this all cut off, then Richmond's not going to have the supplies that they're going to need to hold off. And so he fights here on, actually the siege begins on June the 18th. And that was an attack onto the embattlements of Petersburg. Petersburg, there was a fellow there by the name of Dimmick, and Dimmick constructed large berms of defensive positions, and it was virtually impossible to get past them. So on the 18th, the Union Army tried, and they were pushed back pretty dramatically. Captain Cutts took a shot in the chest in there. He was recognized again by his commander as being gallant in action at Petersburg in leading the troops on his attack on Petersburg. The story then is pretty much over as far as the Civil War is concerned. On April 1st, 1865, the Union Army actually breaks through a siege line at Petersburg and forces Lee out of Petersburg. So now it's a race. They race to Appomattox Courthouse, and the war comes to an end. Captain Cutts was a brevet colonel by that time, brevet lieutenant colonel, and he and his uncle actually went back to Washington, D.C., and then back into Richmond to work on the Confederate archives of the war. So he did that. Following that, then he was sent down to New Orleans, and he became a director in New Orleans. He left the Army in 1868. His wound, he never got over his wound. He had two choices. He could either take Ludlium, which is a drug, or he could take alcohol to ease the pain. Being down in New Orleans with one lung blown out was probably not a very pleasant thing for him. So it was claimed that he became an alcoholic. He was a lawyer, and eventually, through some circumstances of which my time is over with, he ends up applying for medals of honor because other soldiers were doing that as well. And when they went out to research him to be a recipient of a Medal of Honor, they found that he was actually gallant beyond belief in 3 separate actions. So he received 1 medal. Let's go to the last slide. Next slide, next slide. There he is in his older age. Next slide. There is the actual medal. It was in the possession of his granddaughter out in California. This is actually an 1895 Medal of Honor. He was originally given an 1891 Medal of Honor, and so this is what they have out there. The granddaughter still has it. I'm not sure she's even alive anymore. Next slide. When you follow things through, you follow them all the way. So I went to his grave at Arlington National Cemetery and found this. Next slide. Here I am in a younger age when I had dark hair. Believe it or not, this was in and around 1999. So I was probably around 40, 50, around 50.
I'm 29.
Yeah, 29 there. And the next slide. There, after the book was published in 2001, I took it down, gave 8 copies or 10 copies to James Madison Cutts IV. And that's his, so we were pleased with that. Just a wonderful gentleman. I can tell you stories about him. And that's pretty much the story. So, not a classic, not probably the most well-written book in the world today, but it's mine and I love it to death. I hope you do. See, tough time doing it in 30 minutes.
Thanks, we appreciate it so much. I can't walk behind that. Ben, we wanted to give you this as a token of our appreciation.
Oh, but thank you.
Thank you. It has a copy of our full test on the back of it. And we're going to stand right now and say that. You should say what you got.
My pleasure.
4-way test are the things we think, say, or do. First,
Is it true?
Second,
Is it fair to all concerned?
third,
Will it build goodwill and better friendships?
fourth,
Will it be beneficial to all concerned?
and fifth. Is it
Good fun.
Thank you.